All right, welcome everyone, and especially all of you who had to adjust your schedules today because of the United States continues to observe daylight savings time on its own clock compared to everybody else. But I'm glad that we have so many people here, and of course it'll be recorded and made available. I'm very happy to welcome on behalf of the History of Economics Society and the University of Lyon, and Rebecca and Miriam, Edith Kuiper, who will be here to talk about progressivism, abortion and eugenics. So I think it'll be a very interesting discussion. And many of you may know Edith's recent book, Her Story, which somewhat connects, I would think, right? At least in the time period. Anyway, it's a wonderful book. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I highly recommend it. Here comes Rebecca. She's made it. All right. So I was just introducing Edith, and I guess if you're ready to go, I will turn off my microphone.
Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Marianne, and also Rebecca and Miriam for inviting me, for organizing this seminar, which is quite amazing, I must say. Let me share my screen. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about eugenics and abortion and progressivism. So I would like to kind of keep on the format that has been used in this seminar. So I would like to start with some key statements and then explain how things are set up. And at the very end of my presentation, I have some central references for anybody who's interested, but particularly for the students of Rebecca. My focus will be on kind of bringing in the eugenics approach and explore how that relates to progressivism and the thinking about abortion economic. Okay. Just a trigger warning for those who are sensitive to that. We'll be talking about abortion, which can become quite explicit. So please be aware and take care of yourself. Okay, some key statements then is the first one: eugenicist ideas around population growth, immigration, causes of poverty become part of economic thinking in the US in the first decades of the 20th century. So these notions are also taken up by progressives, and these were economists, but also feminist activists and policymakers. So part of this group, home economists, they claim women as experts on consumption, on household behavior, and as such, you could say, claim the field. Okay, eugenicist policymaking involved data collection, that's where they start out, and then they propagate the segregation of certain groups, forced sterilization, limitation to immigration, specific groups, and as an extreme and final solution is a term that was used, extermination. Okay. And then abortion becomes a topic of public concern and policymaking during the second half of the 19th century. I'll talk a bit about the context, when conservative strategists start to use the concept of the right of the fetus. The movement for birth control, it comes up in the 20th century, distances itself increasingly from abortion while propagating contraceptives. Okay, so the organization of my talk will be first the development of eugenic movement, then the propagation of eugenic ideas by early economists, the contribution of progressive thinkers to the eugenic movement and the use of eugenic notions in their thinking, and then a debate on abortion located in this field of tension. Okay, let's see. Right, so we have been talking in this seminar about this kind of bringing back in your memory these discussions that Marianne talked about, that Miriam talked about, and that is that political economists, classical economists like Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and others, they took population growth into account, and they were interested how population growth had an impact on national economic growth, on the wages, on poverty, on inequality. So population growth was an inherent part of the study of the economy. So, for instance, too high population growth was perceived as to cause poverty, and population growth in itself was perceived as being caused by lack of moral restraint and immorality. So population growth was part of the economic forces, so to say. What we see is that too low population growth due to immigration, decline of fertility rates, especially on the middle and upper class in the United States, becomes an issue and invokes anxiety around the health and the race and the quality of the race at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so this is where I more or less start. So I would like to start with the emergence and the rise of evolutionary and Darwinist thought. So it's in 1859 that Charles Darwin publishes his Origin of the Species, and Herbert Spencer has his first book in 1851. So their reasoning is that Charles Darwin wrote about the evolution of the species, right? Focused primarily on the biological world. And when he talks about society, he says that working class should not use contraception and abortion, not really necessary. Let evolution take its course. So what he says about women is that women are more focused than men on sexual selection, and in general, they are less developed than men. It's a really rough report on Darwin, but I think that covers most of it. Herbert Spencer then applies evolutionary thought to analyze and describe human society. Right. So initially in his book on statistics in 1851, he states women and men as basically equal, but that changes later on. So later on, he really perceives men as particularly white men, Anglo-Saxon men, as higher developed than women. Women were considered to be more focused on the reproduction and on raising children. He also ranks cultures. He describes them in various stages of development. And for Spencer, the race, so to say, that is able to free up women's time to totally focus on the birthing and raising of children he perceives that as the highest stage of evolution, of development. So these are evolutionary thinkers, right? And it's good to really distinguish those from the eugenic thinkers. In the second half of the 18th century, eugenics develops. It's Francis Galton, who coins the term eugenics, which stands for good breeding. Eugenics as such describes a movement to improve human heredity by the social control of human breeding, based on the assumption that the differences in human intelligence, character, temperament, later that's been added as, the kind of physical features like blindness and deafness and other features, that they are largely due to differences in heredity. We'll talk more about that. Positive eugenics, or is a distinct, you can make a distinction, was made at a time between positive and negative eugenics. And Galton was particularly interested in positive eugenics, although he also talks about negative eugenics. And positive eugenics is the idea that healthy people, mostly middle class and higher class Anglo-Saxon Nordic people, would be good to have them breed among themselves, so that you would have more people that were genetically healthy, that are the healthy stock of the population would grow larger than the deficient people, so to say. So Galton is really interested in bringing about a race of geniuses, so to say. Carl Pearson is much younger. Here they are. The left one is on the picture is Pearson. The right one is Galton. And he kind of follows in the footsteps of Galton. He names the library for national eugenics that Galton started. He names that the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics. And Pearson shifted the focus somewhat towards negative eugenics. So negative eugenics aims at limiting or preventing the reproduction of what was considered degenerate and unfit families. So, okay. When we look at the British economists and how they use eugenic reasoning, what comes to the fore is this group of Fabians that is active in London. H.G. Wells was part of that, Shaw was part of that, and they were all into eugenic thinking. So Sidney and Beatrice Webb, you see them here on the picture. Sidney is on the very left, and in the right corner is Beatrice Potter Webb, and then you have the Shaws sitting next to them, between them, sorry. So Sidney and Beatrice Potter Webb, for instance, but mostly in all of their work in Industrial Democracy in 1897, they talk about people as, and those deficient of intellect, the epileptic, the mentally ill. They characterize those as the feeble-minded, the criminal, and those who are incapable of producing their own maintenance at any application whatsoever. These people were perceived as being deficient in character, as being morally deficient. And then the argument developed in such an extent that these people should be separated out, should be segregated, and should be, in the end, be made extinct. William Stanley Jevons applies similar notions. He claims in a theory of political economy that he cannot distinguish between Aboriginal people, but he can distinguish between Anglo-Saxons. But I'll have a quote of him later on. Somebody else, William Beveridge, who's really important in the development of British welfare state. He's also Fabian. He's a faculty member of the LSE, and he was actively involved in the building of the Eugenic Society and movement in London. Alfred Marshall also applies evolutionary thinking, but also eugenic notions. So I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we have John Maynard Keynes, right? So these are big names in economics that use eugenic notions in various ways and to various extent, but that's important to realize. Okay. So, for instance, a few quotes, William Stanley Jevons, he, for him, questions of this kind, and then he talks about the work effort, depends greatly upon the character of the race. Persons of an energetic disposition feel labor less painfully than their fellow men. And if they happen to be endowed with various and acute sensibilities, their desire of further acquisition never ceases. A man of a lower race, a Negro, for instance, enjoys possession less and loathes labor more. His extensions therefore soon stop, right? Put it differently, Negroes are more lazy, they're less ambitious, they're less interested in material goods. Poor savage would be content to gather the almost capricious fruits of nature if they were sufficient to give sustenance. It is only physical want which drives them to exertion. it's kind of interesting how this language and these notions develop in England also when talking about Irish people, right? So this is kind of, you could say, heavily based in class, and then subsequently in race. Alfred Marshall uses similar terminology: savage life ruled by custom and impulse. Savage life is ruled by custom and impulse, never forecasting the distant future, seldom providing for neat future, servitude to custom, fitful, governed by fancy of the moment, incapable of steady work. You could say a whole bunch of prejudices are here put together and projected on what's considered a lower race. Okay, so what happens, and this is what we'll be focusing on, what happens in the United States, right? It's particularly negative eugenics that moves to the United States. So in the United States, it's Charles B. Davenport, who is crucial in the foundation of the eugenic movement. He published a whole range of books. This is one of them: Eugenics, the Science of Human Improvement Through Better Breeding. There is this, in the beginning, close connection between the Association for Breeding, Agricultural Association for Breeding, and there's also a heavy foundation for eugenics in the Department of Agriculture in the United States. So he founds this station for experimental study of evolution in Cold Spring, that is Long Island, New York. And what he does is, beginning of the movement, is they start with gathering data, right? Data, and in gathering data, they develop their arguments, their theories, and they ask public institutions and newly founded institutions that they kind of push to be founded. And these institutions, like schools, like hospitals, like mental institutions, in the beginning, they are really kind of naive, and they just send over all their data, whereas some of these institutions become more wary when they realize how these data sets are being used, right? So, to organize this data collection, the Eugenic Records Office in New York is being founded and plays a coordinating role in the movement. That is not possible. The whole growth of the eugenic movement is not possible without substantial financial support, and it is the capital from large corporations and that are being used to provide this funding. So Carnegie Institution is important, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Edward Henry Harriman fortune. There was a railroad capitalist who died, and then his wife, Mary Williamson. Harriman becomes really important as a sponsor of this early eugenic movement. Once that is more or less in place, there is a shift towards the push for legislation that would work as a legitimation of this whole eugenic approach, and then more broadly, a set of policies. So what we see, for instance, the first law that's really based on eugenic thinking was in 1907 in Indiana. And it is here a typo. 1924, there is an immigration law that's also really applies eugenic notion to setting the boundaries of immigration to the United States. So many progressives then kind of get eugenics on their screen. Eugenic thinking becomes increasingly important in social sciences and in economics in particular, and progressives increasingly saw eugenics as a way to achieve their goals of social improvement through, you could say, a shortcut. Okay, so what kind of policies did the eugenicists propagate? So first they said, okay, when we have identified those individuals, but also those family lines that are hereditary, problematic, right, in the sense that families would have a tendency to become criminals, to become prostitutes, to become blind, that kind of thing. These families would have to be separated from society in institutions. So segregation was an important first step in these policies. So set apart those who are considered deficient from the rest of the population in other institutions. Next step was in 1907 decided upon to, and that was forced sterilization. So if people were, there was a decision made that they were deficient, they were morons or idiots, then they could be subject to forced sterilization. So since 1907 to the 1960s, 70s, there's this official number of 60,000 people that were they were forcibly sterilized, but it's probably many more. So particularly applied, this policy was applied to African American, Puerto Rican, and Native American women, and whites also, who were considered feeble-minded, criminal, deaf, morons. So the criteria for which one could be decided upon, that one was a moron, one was an idiot, or one was deficient in moral character, those, of course, it was very difficult to really set those boundaries, and they have been the early decades of eugenic movement was focused particularly on that. And then a discussion that goes way back to the 19th century is the concern about immigration in the United States. So the aim was to protect the Anglo-Saxon Nordic race and to keep out what was called the low-quality immigrants. So somebody like Richard Ely really writes extensively about this concern that something needs to be done because there are these immigrants from Southern Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean races, that kind of mix up and pollute the races, what they call the Native American races, which was, of course, they were not Native Americans, they were white Americans, which claimed to be native to the United States. Okay, and then as an extreme version, policies that get particularly applied in Nazi Germany is the extinction of the whole groups of the population. We see that language popping up over the decades that eugenic thinking emerges. Okay. What you see here is that, yeah, I'll talk about that later. Good. So eugenic thought in American economics. What you see is that by the end of the 19th century, American economics kind of shares the idea that laissez-faire is a good idea, but a lot of people in the field have more or less a religious background. And what happens then is that a whole group, as you will be aware, of new students, young economists come in from Germany. They have been trained by Smoller and other German economists, and they also bring these evolutionary and these historical and eugenic notions into economic thinking. So I think I have to speed up a little bit. So a few of them I mentioned here, Francis Amasa Walker, really clearly, and these are important, crucial figures in the emergence of the American Economic Association. They're also presidents of the Bureau of the Census. Edward Ross is, yeah, I wanted to talk about that. He is generally considered a sociologist, but he's also involved in the founding of the American Economic Association. And he's the one that coins the term race suicide. So race suicide is a kind of the flip over of this idea, this Darwinist idea that the survival of the fittest, right? If you have, according to the thinking of Darwin, you would have the strongest and most well-developed race would kind of be the winner of the competition. But now this changes because there's a recognition that the birth rate under white middle class and upper class white people declines faster than that under immigrants and under African Americans, the idea becomes 180 degrees different, namely is that the deficient races will take over the more higher developed white race, and that's called race suicide. Okay, Simon Patton, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he was the president of the American Economic Association in 1908. He talks about theory of abundance, he talks about consumption of wealth, and he really applies this whole thinking around eugenics, deficiency of populations and extinction of populations. And there are a few others. Irving Fisher is actually stands out because he is important in the development of economic thought, but he's also, as the flip side of his life, you could say, he's really active in the propagation of the eugenics movement. Okay, so that's just a few, how strongly eugenics was represented in early economics. Okay, well, let's zoom in on abortion now. Just to give you a bit of a view of the land and the shifts in the legal landscape. In 1821, Connecticut comes up with the first law to criminalize abortion. Until then, abortion is kind of left free until the quickening, right? We talked about that earlier on. Miriam talked about that. Marianne talked about that for Sweden. In general, people involved in abortion are being left alone, except when deaths were involved. Then people were pursued. So it's in 1857 that the American Medical Association launched a campaign to criminalize abortion, and in 1860 they passed a resolution condemning abortion at any stage. So there's a radicalization there. A strong voice in the field, Horatio Storer, declares 8 years later, 1868, abortion to be murder at any stage. And he argues that because by talking about the fetus and focusing on the fetus as a being that is independent of the mother, so there's a shift away from concerns about the mother towards concerns about the fetus, right? So the fetus is considered an independent unit surrounded by what he referred to as the inert matter of the womb. I think that's interesting to see how these are contrapositioned. Okay, in the 1980s, there's the New York Times sets up a campaign to go after providers. They interview women. They come up with horror stories around what happens during abortion, which, like we see today, most of them are just that, horror stories. But you see that there's a slow shift in attitude. Overall, what you can see is that in the medical profession, there's a double take on matters, whereas the profession as such is rather stringent in saying, okay, abortion, murder at any stage. Doctors, local doctors who know their patients still help them out to be fixed, to get rid of the baby. So you also see a difference in use of language. The term abortion is generally not used under women who undergo this procedure. They see, speaking in general, abortion before quickening much more as part of the menstrual process. Okay, so abortion takes place, right? It's continuing taking place. And in 1904, there's 6,000 to 10,000 abortions still being induced in Chicago every year, just to give you one data point. And by 1920, there's still 20% of all pregnancies were aborted, and then mostly by married women. So these are women that already have children, don't want to have more children due to financial situation within their marriage. So that is more or less what happens. And in that 1910, every state had an anti-abortion law. So you see that the legal regulation of abortion is really kind of taking over the United States. Kentucky is an exception. And after that, the fight over contraception moves in. And for instance, in 1921, Margaret Sanger starts the birth control league. Okay, so let's look a little bit at progressive movement that comes up in the early 20th century, particularly in economics, right? So when we talk about progressive movement, this was clearly the idea that there would be social change, improvement in social economic circumstances, improvement of human functioning. Some had the end goal of perfectionism, right? The perfect human being in the perfect circumstance. So there's a distinct role of the state through regulation, through social programs, taxation, and public education. And then very important in all this is the role of science. So science is really brought in as a foundation on which these policies should be based. There's the gathering of data that all these progressive thinkers practically are involved in. And there is an aim of social sciences that is directly mentioned, and that is social control. So through social control, the environment could be controlled, efficiency could be improved, and waste could be prevented. So there's a lot of talk about efficiency and about prevention of waste as an aim of policy making. Okay, in talking about progressivism in early economics, I make a lot of use of Thomas Leonard's book, which I found revealing, the illiberal reformers, race, eugenics, and the American economics in the progressive era. It's easy read, is very informative, very well documented. I really recommend it. What he does, however, he makes a strong case that it's the progressives who were the creeps and who used eugenics to do a quick job on social change, and that they actually aimed at getting rid of those who could not make the competition. I think that link is too strong. I think that initially the eugenic movement was really came about from a very conservative, racist motivation. And the progressives, in my view, kind of jumped on the wagon, and some more than others, and some were hesitant, but did not see another way because eugenicist language had become so dominant in economics and elsewhere. Okay, so what you see is that progressive economics and progressive activists, they go along and they think it's actually a good idea to have a separate legislation for women, right? So this distinction between the private realm, which was seen as dominated by women were seen as the guardian of morality in the private realm, whereas the public realm is dominated by men. That division of spheres is really accepted by progressive thinkers, and I think that was a highly problematic move at the time. Women were perceived as, in that sense, again, I mentioned that, less developed as men, and as they had to be considered as a separate category, right? So they deserved a separate legislation in order to protect them as the biological weaker sex from the hazards of market work, to protect working women from the temptation of prostitution, right? If they would be engaging in paid work, they would be working with men, they would engage men, they would be in the streets, and they would, I don't know how that would work, but they would be tempted to engage in prostitutions. So it would be better if they would be just working at home. It would protect male heads of the household from economic competition of women, and it would ensure that women returned to the home could be better carrying out, to have the time to really do their duties as mothers of the race, which was considered their main role in life. Okay. So there are a whole set of feminist thinkers and activists at the time that work in NGOs, in unions, in policy think tanks. Some also work in economic departments, but then they mostly work at the home economics department, which would focus on the household behavior, right? But these thinkers applied eugenic reasoning, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman is somebody who's always mentioned in this respect, because she really built her theory on women and economics on eugenic notions. So others I already mentioned, Beatrice Webb and Sidney Webb in the book Industrial Democracy. Ellen Richards is interesting in this respect. She is the leader, you can say, of what's called the home economics movement. And she writes this book, Eugenics, which is kind of a variation on eugenics. And she says, yeah, eugenics is purely biologically hereditary, but we want to control the environment in order to make to force individuals to civilize, so to say. But her notions, her theoretical conceptual framework is practically that of the eugenicist theorists. But she is able, with her movement, to bring in institutions in, for instance, the Department of Agriculture, a bureau for home economics, a bureau for child care, etc., etc. So, and then she and her movement also claim a place in economics, and they are to some extent able to bring home economics departments to departments, and that is where the research on households then takes place. So Elizabeth Hoyt is one of these women. She's a PhD of Hazel Kirk, who writes a book on the consumption of wealth. And she, because she was trained by a set of eugenic economists, she takes over their research theory. Think of what you may. This is what she does, and yeah, I think it's, when you're trained like that, it's kind of obvious that you have a tendency to keep on doing what you're doing. So that may be also a thing to think about. Okay, so the last one I want to mention is Margaret Sanger. I think we should consider her women economic writer. She's not an economist in the sense that she gets a job in an economics department. There are hardly any women who got a job at women's at the economics department at the time. But she is very important in the women's movement, and she kind of starts the movement for birth control. It's not that long ago that there was a realization that she heavily builds on eugenic thinking. So what she does is she publishes a booklet, Family Limitation, 1914. And in this booklet, she really takes the angle of the working class women. So she speaks up for working class women, and she says working class women should be the ones that make the decision about their reproduction. And they have to be able to choose whether to have an abortion or not. So she's very explicit about that. She gets into problems with the law. She gets arrested a few times, and she really gets pushed back from government, from the direction of the government. Over the years, you see that she shifts her perspective. So until 1921, she really kind of reorientates herself, steps away from the working class, and orientates herself more and more towards middle class, upper class audience, among other reasons that is where she gets her funding from. The impact on the content reflects in the fact that she steps away from using controversial language, and she stops talking about abortion because she finds that kind of harms her case. So another publication from her is Women and the New Race, which also, and by now you will recognize that, heavily built on eugenic analysis, and she articulates there her position on abortion. She still supports women who have abortions, and she perceives that as being applied as a means of last resort, and applied by those women who have a feminine urge to freedom, whose feminine urge to freedom is the strongest, right? So there again, you see the eugenic language coming in. Okay, she starts a Negro project. I mean, eugenics and these notions are all over the place. So what she does is she really is able to build up a very strong movement, and she gets into conversation with the American eugenics movement, and she wants to merge. So the eugenics movement heavily controlled by men, and they're very hesitant. They don't want that, and then they kind of figure out that when they move slightly more into discussing positive eugenics, Margaret Sanger totally cannot go there because that would stimulate the having of children, and she doesn't want to go there. So that's where the deal breaks, and that merge never happened. Okay, so let me wrap up and see what I can make of this thus far. I feel a lot more research needs to be done, but I think we can kind of conclude this far that progressive used eugenic reasoning that was inherently sexist, classist, and racist. And they assigned to women the role of mother and responsibility for the birthing and raising of children. So under progressives, women became perceived as the experts on household issues and consumption. And in the field of economics, home economists were not considered economic experts, right? So you get this task division in which economists kind of negotiate of what goes into home economics and what stays in economics. Progressive economists perceive the state as a tool for change and data collection, as for instance through the Census Bureau, as a means to provide a scientific basis for policy making. Economists continue, when you read the material of these early economists, continue to analyze the household as represented by the male head of the household. Also, Hazel Henderson, in a theory of consumption, there is still this ongoing notion until the very end of the book that focuses, talks about behavior, consumer behavior in the household in terms of the male head of the household, which is interesting. Okay, abortion generally dealt with in silence. This is really, really ultra private matter, right? It's dealt with in terms of secret, silence, or as in terms of horror to kind of scare people about the terrible practices around child mutilation, we would say post-birth abortion, this kind of propaganda that we also have today. But abortion in general was increasingly dealt with as a legal issue, right, by the states, and it was enforced by local authorities. Okay, in the struggle of reproductive rights, the women's movement separates abortion out from the struggle for contraceptives. So it steps away in general from abortion, and it propagates contraceptives as a sound means for family limitations. This is my last few sentences. Economics as a field moves into a different direction, away from including population as an inherent part of the field. So as Simon Patton already states in 1895, by the time this final proposition, that was Malthus' take on the effects of overpopulation, was fairly before the public, the basis of the discussion was shifted from economic to biologic grounds. Malthusianism became Darwinism, and the economists were freed from any need to discussing the law of population as a special problem of their own science. So that's in my view what happens. And then later on, it takes a few decades, but then it's Becker with his economic approach, right? I mean, I talked about that. Who comes back talking again about population issues, demographic issues, but then in terms of this much more narrow approach of the economic approach. Okay, I would like to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion. And I think we can open it now for questions and comments. You can raise your hand or simply turn off your or turn on your microphone.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Ed, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. So first, I have two questions. The one is a very specific one. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that something related with Darwin, that women were more focused on sexual selection. What does it mean exactly? I don't know the meaning of that. And second, this is something that I start thinking during the presentation, the link between the development of the movement of rights for children and this idea that the fetus has rights. How you can put those together, because at the time that they start moving this idea that the fetus has rights, at the same time, the movement for children's rights was almost non-existent. Those were my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. Thank you. Yeah, the fact that Darwin's ideas around women being more oriented to sex selection, Perkins Gilman also talks about that quite a bit. Is that women were first place aimed at reproduction and getting a partner and finding being involved in the reproduction of the race, so to say, whereas men were more oriented to competition in the economy, in building civilization, that kind of things. So there he kind of separates out the two sexes and their aims and what their lives are about. Yeah, does it make sense?
Yes.
The movement of the right of children. Yes, I didn't make that link. So I didn't look at that, which is interesting, right? I think that is interesting. What I kind of suspect is that this takes place earlier, before real movement of the right of children. I think this is speculation, but talking about the rights of the fetus in order to be able to get away from the right to choose for women and to control their reproductivity seems to be more pragmatically motivated by me. But I don't know to what extent that is linked to the discussion around the rights of children, to the concerns about women, children's labor at that time. I don't know. So there is a discourse that I think is a nice idea to check that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Raphael about how influential the ideas of the American economists were for other countries. Right? And he notes that there were already money doctors in the 1920s, right, advising countries around the world. Were there also eugenics doctors, for example?
Okay. Can you help me seeing a question in that? I mean, we're talking about 1920s. That is already late, when eugenics thinking has been very strongly evolved, and that will be reflected in the medical profession. Yes, I definitely think that will be the case. Or did I mention a question? Did I miss the question that is in there?
Yanya?
Yeah, hi, thanks. This was a great presentation. You mentioned when you were going through the The Economist initially and you came to Keynes, you mentioned something about his reluctance on some of these issues, despite being leading the Eugenics Society. And that's kind of been my impression as well. It's hard to pin down exactly what Keynes thought on eugenics, and the same goes with anti-Semitism. It's a little fluid and hard to pin down. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about your perspective on how far Keynes went with eugenics.
I kind of agree with you. You know, I didn't look up Keynes to see what he does there. He had hesitations to, as far as I know, to really reduce kind of economic choices, poverty, and employment to hereditary features. He says it's more a matter of probability. You see these eugenic notions popping up here and there. So I would kind of, from where I'm standing now, I would categorize him in the group of economists who make use of these notions because they're around, that he didn't particularly propagate them, but just use them because they are there. I don't think although he might have made some statements that are more crudely eugenic. So, but I cannot assess Keynes. It's kind of interesting though, because Keynes is such a big economist, and because how would these notions have kind of really kind of structured his economic concepts, right? I think that's the big question here. How have these these eugenic notions structure and got themselves into our definition of concepts and theories that then later become invisible when we start using these concepts and theories outside the context in which they emerged.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yes, thank you, Edith, for your presentation. I'm very happy to see too many people today, despite the time changes. Yeah, I have many questions, but maybe let me focus on two. First, only to better understand what is exactly your criticism to Tim Leonard analysis in illiberal reformers. If you can just tell me again, please.
Okay. Well, if you read the book, it's a bit which is fine, but it's a bit of a crusade against early economists that wanted to use economic thinking and economic policy making to improve the world, to use the government policies to improve economic life for a lot of groups and people. So and I'm still not entirely clear where he wants to go with this argument. It seems that he's, hesitant about government policies, about government interference, because he says, well, this can only end badly. But because I think that commitment, that passion of his, which also kind of drove him to do the research anyway, it's my assessment, and that brought us his book, which I think is really a strong contribution. But I think that the eugenics movement does not have its basis in progressivism, the progressive movement, or progressive economists, or that progressive economists found themselves on eugenic thinking, but that there is an earlier point where conservative forces, racist thinking, really brings about eugenic thinking, takes over the discipline, and that kind of defines the language that progressives then make use of. That is a defense of progressive economists and thinkers, that they're not innocent. I can see that. There is quite a few feminist thinkers and activists, but also economists that use this concept that really downgrading and talking about extinction of groups, I think it's highly problematic. And so I think this deserves an analysis and assessment of, okay, what were these people doing? To what extent was this eugenics, and how has it impacted? Had it impact? How did it impact their economic thinking and reasoning? And I also think that, you know, there's a lot of talk about the repetition of history. We would want to know, how these things work, right? I think the whole theorizing around the welfare state, there is a strong injection of eugenic thinking there. And I think that as progressives ourselves, at least I would see myself in that tradition, I would like to know where this eugenic thinking has structured the reasoning, the arguments, the theory, the approach, in order to prevent it happening again.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, my other question is linked to religion and politics, because I have the impression that when we discuss about reproductive rights, many times religion is very, very present, and politics is a political question, and sometimes we have in Congress some presidents that makes this topic like their political issue. Of course, don't taking into account at all the role of women, the role of, I mean, the happiness of the people in the country, etc. So, do you have what is the place of religion among these eugenics economists, for example? Because I have the impression that religion apparently is not very present. So this is why, for example, in the case that I'm studying, Irving Fisher, he can accept, or Charlotte Perkin-Gilman, she can accept in some cases abortion because the religion is absent. So it's not a evil, it's not a problem. You don't have a punition in the other life because you're not Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, etc. So religion is one topic that I would like to hear you about, and the other one is politics, because you know is in particular in the United States there is apparently this link very strong between the Republicans against and Democrats in favor in the time evolution. We saw this in other webinars that we organized. So I want to hear you about this. Thank you.
Okay. I think it plays a role. I mentioned it very briefly, but I'm not here to defend myself. What I said was that most economists, before this stream of economists comes in from Germany, right? Most economists in the United States had to more or lesser extent, knowledge, background, training in religion. And then these economists that, and more general, this Darwinism starts to replace religion as a basis for economic reasoning. I think that is definitely what is going on, and that is very, very strong. Like, they don't have to base themselves on some kind of, you know, philosopher like Hegel or but they can now base themselves on this scientific theory of evolution or social evolution, or when you add statistical data, you can even base yourself on objective facts, right? And then what you see is that economics takes up this aim to become more and more objective, and with that effort, they take distance from policymakers, from those who are involved in activism, and that also has an impact for women and research they do, and consumer research, because women were marginalized in economic science. They were overrepresented in departments, in departmental research, in policy research, and that kind of makes them becoming even more marginalized. So I think there's definitely story there. yes, on the role of religion and how people negotiate that and bring that in. Actually, when I kind of go back, I think economists in the United States may make more use than you would think about religious notions. So it's kind of interesting to see to how long it still plays a role. The question was, no, I think that was your question, right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have other questions for Edith?
Laura.
Yeah.
Okay.
Laura, we cannot hear you.
Well,
Turn on your mic. No,
No?
try it now. Yes, yes, I
Okay.
think so.
I have a question. It has to do with the use of race in the 19th century. Sometimes it's used in a cultural way and not a physical, biological way. And I have no doubt that Marshall had something to do with eugenics, but the quotations you get, you can see like similar things in John Stuart Mill that certainly had nothing to do with this biological sense of the lower races. But he obviously thought that, you know, the European were more developed than at the time the Black population or the Irish population, but not because of a biological trait, but because of the institutions and things like that. So I had, you know, just one little note on that.
Okay. Yeah, so I also think that's a good point, because that whole kind of the racial issue is way older than when eugenics comes up in the early late 19th century, early 20th century. So you definitely have I totally agree with that point. So it's good to distinguish between evolutionary thought, which kind of, and then even, you know, John Stuart Mill, I don't know to what extent he makes use of evolutionary thought, could be, but that it's that, and eugenics, because these are definitely not one and the same, right? Because if you kind of glue these together, that will lead to the confusion, and the interest is mainly in kind of getting a grip on how eugenic reasoning kind of, because that got off the rails and it ended up in really bad policy making and in disaster eventually. So and my feeling is that evolutionary thought as such doesn't have to have automatically that kind of outcomes or connotations. But it's an interesting line. It's kind of a logical question to say, okay, when did eugenics get on the wagon? To some extent, okay, there's rationalizations, legitimations going on, right? So fake notions that people already had, and now they found a scientific approach to kind of show that they were right. That kind of stuff is definitely been going on. Okay. There's one thing that maybe I have a question about, if people kind of run into that. That's Rebecca's question about religion, and that is that I have not yet been able to kind of really found that link, and that is a link, the fact that the Christian evangelicals, right, have jumped on the wagon of abortion rights. That seemed to have been a rather pragmatic choice of the Republican Party. Yeah, so it's a very interesting kind of play with these big groups in United States society. The choice to make abortion rights so crucial in these two population groups, what made them go for abortion? And to what extent it was racism an underlying cause for that? That's just something I'm still chewing on, and I don't know the answer yet.
And
oh, please, Rebecca.
no, only we find sometimes we find the same in evangelic groups in other countries. In particular, I'm thinking in Venezuela, in Brazil, that also there is a link between evangelic and abortion. So yeah, for me this is also intriguing. So if I have some answer, or if you have some answer, please tell me, and we.
Okay.
All right. Any last question, perhaps, given the time? All right. Well, then I think we would like to thank you very much, Edith. This has been a great discussion, quite fascinating. I have a list of things to write you about as soon as I have a few minutes. There you go. So very thought-provoking. It was really a pleasure to have you here today, and I hope you have a lovely stay in London, or Cambridge, really, right?
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. It was great to be here.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.